All right, welcome. Welcome to our lecture on terrorism for comparative politics at Ohlone College. I'm a little behind on getting some of this information to you guys. I'm going to upload a lecture on democracy in a minute. But first, I wanted to do terrorism, talk about scientific perspectives on terrorism. Hopefully, my video recording is getting a little bit better with trial and error. My face is, you can sort of half see me, a little scrubbly beard going on, so, you know, that's how it is. But let's talk about terrorism. So just a couple of small things about terrorism, the historical origins of it. The word terror in a political context was first used during the French Revolution, during the period that they called the Reign of Terror. At this point, what was happening was, well, France had kicked out their king, then killed their king, and there was a lot of nobles in France, the nobility, that were beginning to resist the revolution. And the Democrats, like Robespierre, if you've heard of him, they started basically just executing aristocrats. This is the guillotine, so think Les Miserables and all that. With very little evidence, and it was called the Reign of Terror because people were very scared, right? So the use of fear for a political goal. Excuse me. Today, terrorism is an attempt to use political violence on non-military targets, specifically civilian targets, to instill fear, but there's a political goal there, and it's a type of asymmetrical warfare. Terrorist organizations, at the very least, perceive themselves to be in having some kind of war. Okay, so where are some places we see terrorism? Historically, terrorism has been most prevalent, actually, in cases of national or ethnic liberation. So Northern Ireland is a prime example, the Irish Republican Army. Basque country in France and Spain. The Basque were a small ethnic minority that some are in Spain, some are in France, kind of split across the border there, and very different from the Spanish or the French. So they're this small ethnic minority that's been around literally for thousands of years. And when nation states formed, they felt that their language and their culture wasn't being sort of upheld and respected by the state enough, and there were Basque movements of national liberation. In Palestine, it's probably the same analysis as well. Gets a little more complicated when religion gets involved. We see terrorism in the United States, domestic terrorism. Some of it's, from all different types of ideologies as well. So some of it is very racially based, some of it has Christian overtones, some Islamic. There's no sort of one ideology that sort of has a monopoly on terroristic behavior. So there you go. Thinking about our book on terrorism, the chapter on political violence, in my opinion, is one of the best in the book. Pay attention to the second half. That's where he's discussing terrorism the most. And his definition is use of violence by non-state actors against civilians to achieve a political goal. Now, what O'Neill does, which is really important and helpful for us, is he gives us a kind of matrix of explanation. What I mean by that is he's got various causes, and we can look at the different causes, and they all kind of matter. But the question is, well, how do we rank and put these causes sort of in a larger sequence that makes sense of any singular terrorist event, okay? So it's a kind of matrix of explanation. They all matter. The three causes that he gives us are institutional, ideational, and individual. Notice one of the most important things here on the ideational side of things, that's just ideas. Ideational just means ideas, ideas matter. One of the most important things here on the ideational side of things is how certain terrorist organizations and actors, guys who are really articulating these types of radical ideology, how they reinterpret pre-existing religious or other types of ideas in order to then justify terrorist behavior and activity. So let's look at institutional factors. One of the things that's commonly proposed as an explanation of terrorism is, well, people are desperate, they don't have education, they don't have a job, and they then become terrorists. That explanation, actually, there's very little evidence for that. It's an appealing one. We want to believe it. It kind of hits at certain notes that we think really matter. But that explanation actually doesn't do a particularly great job. So, for example, it actually seems that people who are middle class or even upper middle class seem to be more prone to terroristic type activities, meaning they're better educated, they actually have some job opportunities and things like that. Maybe not as much as they want, but the simple story that, oh, these people are desperate, they turn to terrorism, doesn't entirely hold up. Similarly, when you just look at rates of political radicalism, it turns out that people who are higher educated and have more wealth are more likely to have very rigid, sort of extreme ideologies. So, think education here. You learn, you're in my class, you're learning about how to make scientific judgments, put together very rational ways of thinking about the political world, and that actually makes you more idea-based, where your ideas become more consistent. And radical ideology is just a very consistent but also mean set of ideas. So when we look at institutional factors, we want to be looking at other things like state capacity, use of state violence upon their populations, and a simple democratic/authoritarian variable that helps us get at avenues of political participation. And interestingly, as O'Neill shows us, democratic regimes have lower total rates of terrorist activity. Not that it's not there, it's still there, but it's less likely, less prevalent. So weak states, for example, provide more political opportunity for terrorism. They're not as good at controlling and monitoring what's going on, so it's easier to be a terrorist. And authoritarian regimes cut off participatory mechanisms such as voting that enable nonviolent protest, and then violent means therefore becomes more prevalent. So if you channel your protest energies through the state with mechanisms of participation, people tend to feel like, well, we had an election and I lost, I'll wait till the next election, I'll have my chance to have my say then. If there's never going to be another election and you lost or you're losing over and over again, well, then terrorist activity becomes much more likely because you don't see a nonviolent mechanism whereby you can change what's going on. Your only recourse in that case becomes violence. So, one of the key points here is that democratic regimes have lower levels of domestic terrorism, probably because of the greater mechanisms for nonviolent protests, like I was just explaining. But even then, we do see ethnic terrorism, or even, back in the 19th century in America, there were anarchist terrorism. The anarchists would occasionally just drop a bomb in a public place, but there was a political goal there. They thought that if they disrupted the state enough, that people would get frustrated with the state and some kind of anarchist utopia would come after that. If you've seen the movie Fight Club, what they did is domestic anarchist terrorism. That's basically what they did. So keep that in mind. But where do we really see it? Most in democratic regimes, it's most common to see ethnically motivated terrorism because small ethnic minorities lose over and over again in majoritarian decision-making processes. So even though there's a mechanism there, they just don't have enough votes, and they end up losing over and over and over again, with the consequence that they feel like, well, although this is democratic, we get to have our say, we still lose over and over and over again, so that really sucks, and we don't feel like this participatory nonviolent means really is giving us what we need, so then you turn towards more violent solutions. Ideational factors, what we mean by ideational factors here are factors of ideas and culture that really matter. So the power of ideas. Again, ideational factors matter, but they're really hard to tease out sort of which is more important. Do the institutions come first? Do the ideas come first? It's really hard. But we want to ask this question. When and why do people reinterpret ideologies to make them justify violent behavior? The Christian religion doesn't justify violent behavior. Neither does Islam. It's a religion of peace, at least if you talk to 99% of Muslims. So the question is, what's going on with those few fundamentalists, whether they're Christian, Muslim, Buddhist, which we have an example of in our book? What's going on with those individuals that's causing them to then reinterpret their religion in this more radical way? So when does a radical ideology begin? So this is largely a question for political elites, meaning leaders in some sense, because you do need to have someone with some training, say, in the Bible to start sort of looking through for passages that can justify what you're trying to do, etc. So it's a question about political elites. Notice O'Neill, he analyzes Osama bin Laden, William Pierce, and Ashen Wurathu, and he does those three because it's a Christian, a Muslim, and a Buddhist. And the point here is, again, got to emphasize, it's not about religion X is Y. There's not much. Political scientists don't put much stock in arguments like that. They're too big, they're too broad, they don't hit anything. It's this weird religious essentialism where it's like, oh, you believe this, and then it just determines the entirety of your actions. No one really buys that, okay? Notice what's happening with these types of guys. They are self-consciously, they know what they're doing, trying to articulate a radical ideology that justifies using violence for political purposes. So when we're looking at these religious manifestations of terrorist activity, we can't get beyond politics. It's not like we can just have some apolitical analysis. In fact, the political analysis here is incredibly important. Then next we have individual factors. And the key question here is, when and where do regular people become attracted to these radical ideas? So there's one question of, what leads someone to start a program of reinterpreting an ideology, trying to sell it to people? But then the other question is, when, why, and where are people buying this ideology? And that's a different question from, or it could be the same, but it's we need to think about it analytically as a different question from the simple question of, or the first question of, why do these ideas begin to be articulated in this? And one of the key factors here is people really have to have something that they're upset about. This is what Martha Crenshaw would call a legitimate grievance, okay? So lots of different things here. Could be like the Basque. It could be an ethnic group that's just losing over and over again at the ballot box, and that really sucks. It's like, you want to have schools in the Basque language, and you vote, and then you lose, and then, well, can I vote? No, you can't vote in Basque either. Everything has to happen in French, and you get frustrated. That's really hard, and you might try to have reasonable accommodations, and no one's listening to you. So you need to have a legitimate grievance. And then secondly, your opportunities to pursue redress of that grievance need to be limited as well. So maybe the authoritarian dictator came and took your child, your cousin, your husband, whatever it is, and you can't go to the cops. Cops just laugh at you. Yeah, we're gonna drag Gaddafi in to and find your brother or whatever. Like, it's just not going to happen. So then, angle of any way of sort of trying to fix this problem gets cut off. And then because there are no legitimate nonviolent outlets to pursue your political goals, violence becomes more likely. In the end, one thing that ends up happening is terrorist organizations do look a lot like a religious cult. not a regular religion, a religious cult, very tightly knit, a strong difference between inside and outside group. We saw this in the Irish Republican Army. We see this in a lot of contemporary terrorist organizations. You have this, they really do have a strong cultish feel. Especially if violence has been used against you and or your family, the desire for revenge can motivate people to adopt radical ideologies that in turn justify violence. And, you know, it's an interesting question here of how much the ideology really matters. If you're just motivated by revenge because you saw somebody hurt your family, the ideas might not actually matter that much, honestly. They might be a sort of convenient thing. Osama bin Laden might like it because he's really motivated by his ideas. But in the end, it could just, quite frankly, be simple as violence. If you've ever seen the movie Princess Bride, there's this character in there, Inigo Montoya, and he goes around saying, "My name is Inigo Montoya, you killed my father, prepare to die." His entire life has been motivated by revenge. But if you saw your father get killed in front of you, you might feel that same way too. Just think about that. Like, that's the story in the movie. This happens in authoritarian regimes. It's much more likely this happens. Seeing that happen, a lot of people become very consumed by that desire for revenge. And in that case, you're more concerned about just fulfilling that revenge than you are perhaps about larger political platforms. Again, notice there's a sort of important overlap between some of these, between some of his causal factors. So the role of institutions here really matters. Repressive regimes, more likely to use violence on their populations, less likely to have nonviolent mechanisms to pursue political goals. So the question of, can you pursue this goal in another way, really does matter. Let's take a look at what a radical ideology just looks like. O'Neill makes a big deal, this first category, he calls a hostility to modernity. By modernity, all he means is capitalism, democracy, individual rights, the internet, all of this kind of stuff, okay? I actually disagree with him on this one. We see a decent amount of contemporary terrorism being anti-modern, but I'm just a little nervous about that, and here's why. Historically, first, terrorism has been used to push modernization and democracy as well. So, when we see terrorism historically, maybe today it's a little more prevalent in its sort of anti-modern form, but I'm just not entirely convinced by that. And secondly, what O'Neill does make an important point out of that I think is really important is the role of humiliation, of feeling as if you have no ability to change what's happened to you, and that bad things are happening to you. So for example, when a person sees himself being humiliated by capitalist modernizers, they tend to become anti-capitalist and anti-modern. When oppressed by reactionary authoritarianism, they usually become democratic and pro-modern. So the analysis here runs from who's your oppressor, and you're going to adopt a set of ideas just opposite to that. Okay, that's my way of thinking. The other thing to keep in mind here about the whole the anti-modern thing. I mean, terrorists love the internet. That's how they recruit, right? So I don't see them as being completely anti-modern. There might be a strong history here of a certain kind of sort of reactionary modernity, we might want to think of it that way, that can be traced again actually back to the French Revolution. And after the aristocrats were having their heads cut off, what did they do? Well, they did become actually sort of anti-modern, but in a more modern kind of way. They reinterpreted what was going on and established a sort of new, very conservative, but still modern ideology. I should actually follow up on that. It's a pretty good idea. So I'm not so sure about the first factor. I think the humiliation matters more. Second factor, some kind of notion of cosmic war, a bigger fight that we're all part of, creating a group of righteous saints pit against a larger corrupt and evil population. And one of the important factors here is it dehumanizes those who are not part of the struggle. Okay, really important factor here. It dehumanizes those who are not part of the struggle. And then third, there's a kind of utopian solution here. We see this in most terrorism, but again, not all. When you look at ethnic movements of liberation, they don't tend to be as utopian. The ideology actually is a little bit tamer, interestingly, because they're really focused on national or ethnic self-determination, and they tend to basically say, look, once the Basque are free, once the Northern Irish are free, once the Algerians are free, you know, it's not like things are going to be perfect, but they're going to be better. This is a very sort of achievable political goal. But we do see a lot of utopianism in terrorist ideology. You know, once the righteous saints have cleansed the earth of the evil, corrupt oppressors, then a new and better world will appear, one in which the righteous saints will be rewarded and honored. Everyone's going to think of them as heroes. Again, the analogy with anarchists in the 19th century who did things just like plant bombs in public places and things like that works here really well, okay? They had a utopian sense. Think Fight Club. They had a utopian sense of what this other world would look like, and they were motivated to try to achieve it. So, you know, again, not all ideologies that justify terrorism actually have all three of these characteristics. I think O'Neill is a little too hung up on, you know, terrorism post 1980, roughly. But if you go back a little bit earlier, I don't think it's all, you know, even if you look at Marxist, which there was a lot of Marxist-oriented terrorism, it wasn't anti-modern. Had those other two characteristics, cosmic war, a utopia on the other end. It had all of that kind of stuff, but most certainly did not have, Marxism is not anti-modern. It's pro-modern. They're so modern, they're looking for more modern than modern. So, you know, just keep that. But where did Marxism really develop out of? A reaction to, you know, very conservative authoritarian politics in Europe in the 19th century. And so they were being oppressed by conservative czars in Russia. So no big surprise that the Bolsheviks are some of the most radical revolutionaries out there. Same in France, very conservative monarchies that created these kind of very radical but very progressive, like in the sense of going forward type ideologies. So some of them are anti-modern, some of them are essentially modern. You know, that whole modern thing, I just not super sold on. Okay, so let's look at the supplementary readings. We have two from what we should think of as a rational actor model of political science, and you know, they're thinking of terrorist actions as strategic, as in some sense rational ways of trying to achieve their political goals. You might think it's irrational to be terrorist, but it's important to remember that's a kind of moralistic, not a really scientific way of thinking about rationality. And if there was no other way to achieve your political goals, then violence might indeed become a very rational way of trying to pursue your goals, right? Like, I'm not allowed to vote, I'm not allowed to express my opinion, these bad things are happening, I just as a person feel like I can't let that continue, so what am I going to do? You know, I go to violence. You know, one of the things to keep in mind here is that terrorist activity really has a goal, and they're using what they perceive to be the best means to achieve that goal. Secondly, these sort of institutionalist arguments emphasize the role of institutions in channeling violent or nonviolent behavior. See Martha Crenshaw, page 339 to 340. That's from her pages, the supplementary reading, not from O'Neill. Okay, so that's up online already. So Crenshaw makes a distinction between what she calls permissive factors, which are things that are sort of necessary but don't tell the whole story, and precipitating factors, which are things that directly cause terrorism. Okay, so permissive factors are ones that make terrorism more likely, but are not direct causes of terrorism. For example, modernization, social customs that condone violence against the state. So if there's a tradition of violent protest against the state, stuff like that, then it's more likely to have terrorist activity. And then lastly, state capacity. So weak states are more prone to terrorism. Now, precipitating factors are the direct causes of terrorism, and she has three here. Concrete grievances, sort of already talked about this, lack of opportunity for political participation, and then a trigger event. We haven't mentioned this yet, but I do think that this is a sort of important, an important variable here, such as the unexpected and unusual use of force in response to protest or reform. Okay, so basically, what if one day you are out there protesting and you're in the United States and you just go down and you're protesting up there in Oakland or whatever, and normally what happens is the cops arrest a few people and maybe some weirdos around the edges get a little excited and smash some windows and they get arrested. What happens if the cops just start shooting into the crowd, right? They just say like all these protesters are bad, and they just like complete disproportionate use of violence. How would you feel if that happened? Might you be more likely to use violence? Say, I'm not going to any more protests. Like all that happens is I'm going to get shot, so it's time for me to shoot somebody. So a trigger event, very common. This is an important part of a very important part of thinking about causes of terrorism, right? Very, very important. Could be the assassination of one of your leaders, right? This happens a lot too. You have a prominent political leader, he gets assassinated. People feel like, well, what's all this for? Terrorism more likely to happen. So we need to think about here, what we could call in-group rationality, which is the rationality of group life. Okay, so Martha Crenshaw is trying to say, look at the internal organization of terrorist groups and look at how it's actually very rational, their sort of use of emotions. Okay, so specifically trust, vengeance, and guilt. So first, by cutting off members from non-terrorist ties and creating strong bonds of internal trust, terrorist organizations, this is the Colt angle, are able to control the flow of information and create a strong sense of in versus out group identity, right? Very important. Secondly, the role of vengeance and guilt. So I already talked about vengeance a little bit. Again, vengeance might be the most important, that might be enough right there. Even Machiavelli, who's not the nicest guy in the world, he says, whatever you do, don't inspire hate in your population, because if people hate you, they will just, their only goal will be vengeance, and then you can't control them anymore. They'll just do anything to get vengeance. So even Machiavelli, who justifies a lot of use of violence, really got to be careful about using too much, because you might, if you make people too mad, they're going to turn on you, and vengeance and hate are the main thing to be avoided. Not a big surprise. There's very strong statistical evidence that shows that if you or a family member or a close friend of yours was in some sense assaulted, if there's use of violence upon you or a close person you're much more likely to say, yes, violence in response to violence is justified. So that's the vengeance question. Now, guilt is a little more interesting. What Crenshaw says, and which may indeed be true, is there's a kind of collective guilt that gets established in these terrorist organizations that we've all basically participated in these things together, and so we all sort of share this burden. In a way, it's kind of similar to gang activity, where urban gangs will have ritualistic, uh, you know, murders and fights and things like that. But it's a way of creating a sort of shared responsibility in the group, shared guilt, and then people get you for that, and it binds you together. Now, Obershall is really interesting, and he adds an important element here. He's building off of Mansur Olson. He works really well with Crenshaw. He's not looking actually at the emotive side nearly as much, but he's looking at very strongly the institutional and rational actor side. And his analysis is quite nice. Um, so look at how he applies the 4 dimensions of collective action to terrorism. That's page 427 of Obershall's article. Really helpful. And compare his analysis of Islamic terrorism with Abrams. I mean, it may be the case that these different explanations are pretty similar. And despite the fact we're using different terminology to explain what's going on, they may not be that different at all, okay? And then notice Obershall has a really nice analysis of institutional capacity of where do terrorist organizations recruit, and that's a big missing piece from Abrams and Crenshaw. So that's one of the main reasons I put this particular reading in there, which is, why do terrorists, where do they get the institutional capacity to recruit? And Obershall does a good job sort of showing that. But then ask yourself, when you look at Obershall's overall analysis, does it actually unintentionally reinforce Abrams' arguments? And I'm going to show you Abrams right now. Really interesting question here, despite the fact that Obershall is using a very strongly institutional type of analysis. It's very unclear how much the institutionalism can be a really helpful guide for sort of getting traction on what's going on, but it might just be a redescription of political sociology. So let's talk about some political sociology. So Max Abrams, what we should call the sociology of terrorism. He calls it a natural systems model. This is a cultural or political sociological approach to thinking about terrorism. Notice the first thing he does is he criticizes the strategic model. When he's criticizing the strategic model, he's thinking of Martha Crenshaw specifically. A few other people as well, but he's read Crenshaw's argument. He's trying to criticize her argument. So he has these 7 puzzles. You really need to work through these 7 puzzles. I don't buy all of them as being strong criticism of Crenshaw's argument, but some of them really are. And so just keep that in mind. But you want to sort of play with these 7 puzzles that Abrams brings out and see how strong are they really criticisms of Martha Crenshaw. Most important thing here, it's not about rationally pursuing a political goal. It's about formation of what your goals are. So you don't have a political goal and then join a terrorist organization. What happens is something happens to your brother. The terrorist organization comes and says, oh, you're mad? We're mad too. You go, oh, great, you're mad too. Then you sit down at a meeting. Then you start adopting terrorist ideas. Then you start thinking, I'm ready to blow somebody up. Then they give you the means and plan to do it, and then you go do it. So notice how it's this really important way of showing how Abrams thinks. It's not about sort of having these ideas outside of the organization and then coming in and joining. It's really about you're just kind of confused and you're angry and you're upset. You get into an organization and they give you a set of answers to all of these problems. Well, that's changing who you are. That's changing your preferences, your values, right? It's a socialization process. And so that's what Abrams is really going for here. So, one of the things he's trying to say is like, look, the official ideology maybe doesn't doesn't matter that much. And there could be a kind of disconnect between official ideology and individual motivation. So, for example, let's imagine there's a club of college Marxists. Do the members participate because they believe in Marxism, or because they have a crush on the hot girl or boy who runs the club, or because the club has the best parties? FYI, they do. I don't know if that's true. I just thought that was funny. My guess is they're actually probably pretty annoying parties where everyone sits around arguing about Marxism. Sounds kind of boring to me, but it's another story. But think about that. Why do you participate in, say, going to church? Is it because you really believe in everything that church says and you're like, oh yes? Or is it like community? You're like, well, I like the people. Church in general is like pretty good. Why do you do that? Interesting question. A lot of people, maybe most people, participate in churches more for the community than for the actual ideas, the specifics of the ideas themselves. Maybe the general idea is, yay, God, whatever. But, not that many regular people who show up on a Sunday afternoon are particularly invested in the nuances of biblical interpretation, for example. I certainly am not. That's the end of the lecture. So that brings us to the end of this lecture. Nice little lecture on terrorism for you. Let me hit a couple of important things again. We want to be thinking about O'Neill's matrix of explanation and thinking about how political sociologists and political institutionalists, culture, and rational actor models use these three different variables, these three different factors in explanation. Institutionalists rational actors, they really view the rational response to shutting down a political opportunity for participation is very important. Max Abrams, who's doing a really nice sociological approach, he can accommodate all of that, but really where he gets this nice push is thinking about, are these people, are they really, let's go back to this one. There we are. Are terrorists, maybe we can in the end describe them as rational, but why do you adopt one set of ideas over another? And there can be viewed a strong disconnect between the official ideology and the reason why people are motivated and join these types of groups. If he's right, then the best explanation is some kind of sociological explanation for based on group behavior and how groups sort of interact with their individual members. So it's a very nice, strong criticism of Crenshaw and these institutional ways of thinking. And again, look at that Oberschall piece and ask yourself if his analysis of the unintended consequences of trying to be, so Oberschall has this nice analysis of Islamic terrorism, specifically in Saudi Arabia, and how official Saudi Arabian religious ideology became very conservative as an attempt to sort of be more conservative than the radicals, than the radical conservatives. And what that did unintentionally was actually create a context in which terrorist organizations could actually recruit a little bit easier. Well, that feels to me maybe like it's a sociological sort of moral here. So I don't know. Ask yourself that question. The texts are really interesting on this one. We'll talk about it when we get together on Saturday. Okay. Have a good week.